German citizens and how they were able to cope with the stresses in their community, how they were able to respond to authoritarianism and fascism as it rose. What we want to do today is outline for you examples. This is not a comprehensive list of the ways in which people responded. Um, these are snapshots, these are visions. And what we know is that for every example that we're able to set in front of you, there are countless examples that were never recorded by history. People who chose to resist, but were in some way either unsuccessful or just it wasn't recorded, right? So I want you to think about everything that we're looking at today on this spectrum, that people can move from inaction, which is in itself a choice, to individual action to group action. So that's what we want to explore today. We're going to start at the beginning, which is that following a turbulent set of years in the 1920s, where the Nazis are kind of increasingly gaining a foothold in the democratic system that is the Republic of Germany. This comes to a head in the fall of 1932, when the Germans are able to secure enough votes that they become a legitimate party that has to be reckoned with in this multi-party system. And on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. He is not personally elected. The Nazis, as a legislative group, had been elected in significant enough numbers that their leader, Hitler, was appointed as part of this coalition government. What happens in the next 18 to 20 months is a complete dismantling of the Federal Republic and the democratic system that had existed in Germany since the end of World War I. Hitler had learned that he was going to use the mechanisms of democracy to take it apart. And this is really important for the context of what we're going to look at, because resisting within a functioning, well-maintained democracy is something different than functioning as a resistor in an authoritarian or a fascist state. You can see here these two pictures chosen very specifically to model this really stark contrast of the photo on the left, this republic. It's a representative government. It had a very liberal constitution that in many ways was a vibrant, successful uh, constitutional document. And then again, in 18 to 20 months, we have a party takeover of that federal system, and it's a full dictatorship. Step one in that process, and I'm not going to belabor all of this history, but there's a few things that we just need to have on the table. He comes to power January 30th, and less than a month later, there is a fire in the German parliament building. It's called the Reichstag. It is an arson. There are some disputes still to this day about who started the fire, but the point is that it allows the Nazis and Hitler as the head of this government to declare an emergency. They use the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, Article 48 specifically, and they declare an emergency that immediately allows them to suspend civil liberties and to arrest and jail political opponents. And so within less than a month, you have a near negation of political dissent in the country. You can see here that there is also kind of violent action. The Nazis send the SA, the stormtroopers in the brown shirts, out into the streets, and they're rounding up communists, socialists, and liberals and starting to prevent them from participating in any sort of legislative work in the country. This, again, I highlight the fact that this is taking apart the system from the inside. So the legislature is under duress. And rather than stepping up to support the three-party or the three-branch system of government, the judges, who are already right-leaning conservatives, lean into the Nazi ideology and they support this kind of destructuring of the legislature. You can see here in their statement, just a few days later, March 19th, that they say that they place their full confidence in this new government. So as we're thinking about people who are choosing to resist, these are a couple of early moments where we have to also question what wasn't done, where resistance wasn't present, that the other two co-equal branches of government did not protect their constitutional powers and kind of push back on the executive. The legislature basically grinds to a complete halt on March 23rd. So about a month after the fire, about 2 months after Hitler comes to power. They gather the legislators in the Kroll Opera House because the Reichstag itself has been burned. And you can see marching in here, this photograph on the right, that the SS, who at this time are Hitler's personal bodyguards, but they're still a formidable kind of paramilitary force, are marched in to stand in the aisles as the legislature votes to dismantle itself. They are asked to pass what is called now the Enabling Act, which cedes emergency power to the executive and says that basically legislative control will be subsumed into that um, uh, executive branch in the person of Hitler. This is an interesting moment of kind of personal conviction and personal resistance for several of these legislators. If you look at this chart, you can see that overwhelmingly 68% of the people that are allowed to be there to vote for this, predominantly the Nazis, but other people who have kind of been strong-armed into this position. But you also see dissent. You can see that the Social Democrats have not yet been rounded up. The Communists have. You can see their 81 representatives are absent because they have already been outlawed as a political party. They've been rounded up by the SA, and many of them are already being taken to various kinds of incarceration points. But the Social Democrats vote against this. This is a moment where understanding that as 14% of the vote, they could not move the needle. They could have gone with the flow. But instead, they took a kind of a brave stand and put targets on their own backs by saying, no, this is wrong. And what we know about authoritarians is that the more resistance that happens, the earlier in the process, the more successful it is. So this was a kind of a valiant stand, but it did not stop the Enabling Act from passing. And essentially, following this, we now have a police state because civil liberties have been suspended and because those kind of paramilitary groups are out on the street rousting people that don't conform to Nazi ideology. When I said that this kind of exists on a spectrum, I want us to think of that in layers, that people can move from moment to moment, day to day, and how they respond to situations based on what kind of agency they have in that moment. It also can move if I'm acting as an individual or as a group. So in this next set of examples, I want to talk about individuals who, through all of these years, in one way or another, chose to make a stand, chose to do something um, to put their statement out about how they feel about the Nazis. What you see in front of you is a board that would have been in most towns and cities. It is kind of think of it like a bulletin board behind glass. And this is where the Nazi Party propaganda paper would have been posted, Der Stürmer. And on each of these boards, as in each of the papers, there was the catchphrase, the Jews are our misfortune. Die Juden sind unser Unglück. And you can see here that not only has this been graffitied, but that somebody has crossed out the un, which means un. So instead of the Jews are our misfortune, now it reads more like the Jews are good for us, our fortune. These kinds of small acts do matter. Instead of standing there consuming this news, somebody chose to make a statement in their community saying, this is not acceptable. I take a stand on behalf of these minority people in my community who are being persecuted, that this is abnormal behavior that cannot be tolerated. Another example that spans this continuum of individuals and groups, we're all fairly familiar with the April 1st, 1933 boycott of Jewish stores, where SA members, predominantly SA, but not only, but Nazi uniforms are positioned in front of German Jewish businesses, and they are meant to keep people from shopping in them. It's a boycott of Jewish-owned stores. And we're really familiar with this story. We talk about the propaganda in the international news. A story that often goes unnoticed on this night is that Jewish war veterans, initially kind of individually, but then kind of increasingly in groups, mounted a counter protest. They put on their World War I uniforms. They, if they fit, if they didn't, they still wore their World War I medals. And they went and they stood near these same stores, standing across from these stormtroopers, and they counter protested. They offered flyers and leaflets extolling the fact that Jewish veterans had served in the Great War, that they were patriotic Germans. It's a moment not only of pushing back against the individuals who are persecuting them, it's a moment of trying to change the narrative, trying to offer information to the public that counters the propaganda that they're being fed. And it's a reclamation of their Germanness. They wanted to display the symbols of Republic Germany, not Nazi Germany. And what we see also is that following this, excuse my friend, I do apologize, that following this, there is a ban on Jewish veterans being able to wear their medals that comes along with the Nuremberg laws in 1935. And it's kind of a direct response to this moment and saying you can't even use these symbols of Germany that you've earned. One of my favorite stories, some of these, I wanted to give you examples of really specific individuals who chose to do something. David Bornstein was a Jewish man, and he is using public transportation in Hamburg. He rides the bus line. And this is 1936. So we are now 3 years into the Nazi persecution of the Jews. There are limitations at this point on where he can sit and what he can do. And he's fed up with it one day, and he chooses to use his walking stick. He's using a cane. He chooses to use his walking stick to deface a swastika on the side of the bus. He is seen by a different bus driver. This man doesn't know him very well personally. The bus driver doesn't know David very well personally, but he rode his bus and they didn't get along. He didn't like him. He didn't like the way he and his wife kind of held hands and had public displays of affection. So at its base, it's not a deeply anti-Semitic denunciation when he turns David into the authorities. It's more of a personal vendetta. It is a man he didn't like. He saw him deface a swastika, so he turns him in. David's arrested by the Gestapo as a somewhat elderly man using a cane. He claims that I was leaning on the bus for balance and I accidentally scraped the swastika. So he kind of gets himself out of trouble. But I think this example illustrates the two sides of the coin and the way that people can choose to respond to these kinds of authoritarian systems. On the one hand, you have the bus driver who, without even being ideologically motivated, chose to utilize the system to hurt somebody that he didn't like. And then you have David who, understanding that something as simple as scratching on a swastika as a Jewish man could result in him being imprisoned and placed on trial with an unknown outcome in 1936, chose to do that, chose to still again say, not in my town. This swastika is an abnormal thing and I don't support it. You can see here, unlike many of the stories I'm going to tell tonight, David does walk away from this incident. He ends up being allowed to leave the People's Court, and he flees to Palestine shortly after that. Again, something I think that most people who know something about the Holocaust are fairly familiar with. Following the 1935 Nuremberg laws, you get these signs all over Germany, and then in 1938, you get them in Austria and the Sudetenland that segregate Jewish and non-Jewish space. Benches, and certain kind of public facilities, public telephones, only for Jews, only for Aryans. This photograph on the right of Lily Rosenfeld, most people interpret this. If I was in the room with you, I'd have you deconstruct this photograph. But most people, because this is a bench for Aryans, interpret this as a person enjoying their privilege within a kind of persecuting system. That they assume that this is a woman who is not Jewish and that she's enjoying the fact that she has this bench to herself as an Aryan. In fact, it is an act of resistance. Lizzie was a Jewish woman. This is August of 1938, so it's after the Anschluss. This is Vienna. And this is a small act, again, of saying, in my community, I won't normalize these things. I won't allow this to go unchallenged. And so she not only sat there, but she had the photograph taken. In contrast, we see the flip side. The photograph on the right, it says this is a bench not for Jews. So it's the same scenario. This is only for people who are not Jewish. And we don't know these people. We don't know their story. It could be that every Sunday they go on a walk and they stop and they sit on this park bench. This may be their complete normal. But this is also something that we in the field refer to as anticipatory obedience. The likelihood of there being consequences for them refusing to sit there, refusing to normalize this system is it's likely low. There's a low chance that they would have faced consequences for not complying. But by choosing to sit there, whether it's ideologically like, yes, I'm an Aryan or I don't care, it has allowed something to be normalized. And what we know about fascists and authoritarians is that it doesn't always take the consent of the people. Oftentimes, it just takes the indifference of the people to allow these things to take root. I also offer up this photograph, which is one of my favorite. I teach with it all the time. Again, only for Aryans, park bench in Vienna, and the dog is allowed to sit on it, but not the Jewish people. And I think about whenever I look at photographs, I think about the composition and who took the photograph. And somebody took this photograph. What was their angle on taking this photograph? Is it a commentary, or is it the absurdity of the fact that this dog can sit here but not Jewish people? Is it laughing at Jewish people not being able? We don't know the answer to all of these things, but they are food for thought and they are things for us to grapple with as we navigate choices in our own world. For those of you who have been to Munich, this is again one of my favorite examples of nonviolent resistance. Munich is the location of the 1923 attempted coup by Hitler and the Nazis. They wanted to take over first the Bavarian government and then intended for it to become a nationwide movement and they would take over the German federal government. In this skirmish near the Odeonplatz in Munich, the Nazis lose a handful of men. They are shot and succumb to their injuries. And there is a certain myth of martyrdom that pervades the Nazi period around these men and that coup attempt. The photograph on the right, you can see in the Odeonplatz kind of a shrine or a memorial that was established by the Nazis there in the years that they were in power. And there came a point where it was mandatory to give the Heil Hitler salute as you passed, kind of in respect for these martyrs. And people didn't want to do that. People were not comfortable with the Nazis and the things that were happening. And so one of the ways that they attempted to subvert the system is to walk around it. Instead of going down the main path that took you by this shrine, they cut through this pedestrian street that's now known as Shirker's Alley. You can see it here memorialized with these kind of bronzed bricks. But it was a cut through, it was a workaround. Again, it's not a direct defiance of any individual Nazi. It's not speaking out on policy, but it's a refusal to normalize the system. Eventually, this was cut off. The Nazis figured out why people weren't walking by their memorial. And so they posted people on the ends of the alley and forced them to go through the main path. But it's an interesting way to think about how do you subvert the system? How do you resist in these small ways that kind of forestall a bigger change? I'm going to jump a little bit into um, years where things are more fraught. Right? I mentioned to you that our most successful resistance is often our earliest resistance. That if you reach a point, there are fewer options, right? That doesn't mean it doesn't continue to happen. And one of the primary ways that we see resistance operating in the war years in Nazi Germany is through dissemination of information in various formats. So the people you see in front of you, the Humpels, um, a couple who live in Berlin, and there is a point at which Elise's brother has been killed in the war, and it kind of pushes their dissatisfaction with the Nazis to a different level. And they decide that they are going to start leaving messages throughout their neighborhood, the leaflets, but mostly postcards, and they're just going to leave them in people's mailboxes and on park benches. They're just putting this information out there, trying to plant a seed in other people's minds about the abnormality of what they're seeing and what they perceive as danger. You can see that they're urging some specific actions. They want people to refuse to cooperate, which, as we know, is one of the primary ways for any individual to react to authoritarian system. Um, the Nazis were kind of masters at raising money for certain causes within their system, and they urged people to refrain from supporting those things financially. And interestingly, they really targeted the notion that the war was something that served the German people, that the loss of life, their soldiers, their brothers and husbands and uncles who were, in these deployments were not there for a reason that served them and served their country. It's an interesting way to speak to the community about what their government is doing. You can see here they operated for about 2 years before they were denounced to the Gestapo. At a certain point, all these postcards are kind of being picked up and turned into the Gestapo. And after about 2 years, they are arrested. And for the crime of distributing approximately 287, that's the number we know of, postcards critical of the Nazis, they were tried in the People's Court and they were executed by guillotine. So this was considered treason and a capital offense, leaving these and distributing these kinds of notes that undermined the Nazis and the Nazi war effort. If you go to Berlin today, you can see a couple of memorials. One is a plaque at their former home, and this one on Mullerstrasse is a kind of an enlargement of their handwritten work. And you can see here it says, "Wake up, we have to liberate ourselves from Hitlerism." The Nazis wanted to coordinate culture. They referred to the Volksgemeinschaft as this people's community, and it was meant to be coordinated, Gleichschaltung, to meet Nazi objectives, ideals, priorities. And one of the attempts is through the churches. And one of the questions that we're often asked as Holocaust educators is, what was the response of the religious communities? So I want to just set up for you this kind of contrast. Uh, One of the most important features of Nazism within a church is this German Christian movement. It predates the Nazi takeover of power, so it was kind of moving with the party through the 1920s. And by the time the Nazis take over, it has the full support then of the government, right? It's the government trying to implement a version of Christian nationalism. It's very specifically Nazi, onto German Protestant churches. This was not very successful with the Catholic churches because they have their own structure and hierarchy, and it's kind of just a different bureaucracy to work with. But there is some degree of success within the German Protestant movement. And you can see here to the point that we have a new kind of Christian flag with the swastika built into it. We have swastikas on the pulpits of some of these churches that have adopted this way of thinking. And you can see here some of what they were believing in. They were trying to strip Judaism out of the Bible and out of Christianity. So it was a kind of a rejection of the Old Testament and a denial of Jesus's Jewish identity, and an attempt to strip back any elements of Judaism from Christianity. So then what was the response of the churches? I have to tell you that institutionally, not much. But individually, there are countless examples of people who found cause to reject Nazism and chose to speak out about it in one way or another. One of the most famous examples is Bishop August von Galen. He was a priest who had a pulpit, and in 1941, he is speaking out about the T4 euthanasia program and saying that this goes against the teachings of Christianity and against the teachings of the Catholic Church. He also speaks out on the tactics of the Gestapo, which by 1941 have been very brutal and very successful in suppressing dissent inside of Germany. He is also, like many men of his age and many clerics of this time, an anti-Semite. So it's not that it is speaking out on behalf of the Jews or in a way that refutes the Holocaust, but other elements of Nazism are sometimes what were the tipping point for people and why they would choose to speak out. Pastor Martin Niemöller will be familiar to many of you for his very famous quote, "First they came for." Initially, he is a supporter of Hitler's. He is also an anti-Semite, and uh, he's kind of going with the flow in the early 1930s, but he reaches a point where he cannot reconcile the racial category of Jewishness and the fact that for the Nazis, there is no acceptance of baptism, that a Jew is a Jew regardless of their conversion to Christianity. For Niemöller, that is uh, uh, something within Christianity that he can't make work. And so he ends up joining the confessing church and speaking out somewhat against the Nazis. He ends up being arrested for opposition activities and imprisoned in Sachsenhausen from 1938 to 1945. Just a small tidbit, since probably most of you know that quote. It's not something he wrote. It's something that he spoke in the post-war years. After his own incarceration and after coming to terms with what his country and his government had done in the name of the German people in the post-war years, he started to speak against authoritarianism and these kinds of us versus them politics. And the reason that that quote is always different, sometimes it's first they came for the socialists, sometimes it's first they came for the trade unionists. It's because it was spoken, and it's something that he really just felt and spoke from the heart. And so however it came out that day is how he was quoted. It is one thing to have a pulpit, to have a kind of that megaphone, that audience built in that you can deliver a message to every day. But we also know that many average people who felt some sort of a religious leaning acted in heroic ways. This is just one story. Margaret Sommer, she was a German Catholic social worker. So she was not in any way affiliated with the clergy. She didn't have that kind of a microphone. But she became very active in actively supporting Jewish people trying to navigate this new life. She worked on immigration issues. Later, when there were deportations, she worked on networks helping to hide Jewish people. And she advocated what she referred to as slowdowns. So you might think of this as versions of sabotage, that you may not be able to, as an individual person, stop what is happening. You may not be able to stop your neighbors from being beaten or rounded up or deported, but maybe you can help one person. Maybe you can do something that slows down the machine just enough to allow someone else more time to react and in some way save themselves. That was her advocacy. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the last example I want to leave you with in this set. We think of him primarily as this Lutheran pastor. He was a man who was deeply connected internationally and was able to travel very extensively. And so what actually ends up catching up to Bonhoeffer, and we'll get to this at the very end of the presentation, is not his religious conviction and acting out of religious conviction, but he actually ends up utilizing his extensive religious network and connections and his ability to pass information and connecting himself to the German military intelligence and working through the active kind of military resistance in that way. This last example I want to share with you of an individual is a deeply complex one, but I think it illustrates how people can move and how people can kind of reconcile in their own head how they're going to cope with these situations. So this is Eric Osler. He was a cartoonist in the 1930s, again, predating the Nazis. He is an anti-fascist. He is producing anti-Nazi political cartoons for a couple of different political magazines. You can see here, one is just an anti-fascist magazine. It's not tied to any specific political party, but the other, the Forwards, is the Social Democratic Party's paper. And so his work in the 20s and 30s that was already anti-fascist means that he is banned by the Nazis when they come to power in 1933. This is an example. This is in the Social Democratic Party paper. You can see some of what he's saying here, the criticisms that he has of the Nazis. This one on the left, I think, is instructive. You can see here that these are, again, Social Democratic Party. They're talking about the Nazis beating up the communists. But you can see here that he has depicted the communist on the ground as also as a Jewish person because they're wearing this star. So it's not that this is a man who has deep convictions to protect the Jews from the Nazis. This is a man who is deeply anti-fascist politically. So he's making commentary on who they are as authoritarians and as fascists. The one on the right is a commentary on the perception of Hitler that he likes to put out and who he is really as a person. This kind of weak person hiding behind a facade. This is some of his work. You can see here 1931 specifically, but the period is just relevant. Right before the Nazi rise to power, this is the Anti-Fascist magazine. And you can see here he's taking a shot at Goebbels. He's kind of commenting on the value of the swastika. Just gives you a sense of the kind of work that he was doing. So he's banned in 1933 when the Nazis come to power. And this is still the Depression. This is a man who needs to make a living. And so his method of navigating this path is to work under a pseudonym and to take a less overtly political messaging. He becomes famous for this comic strip, Father and Son, which on its surface does not seem in any way anti-Nazi until you start to really dissect what you're seeing here. This is a man being depicted in a domestic role, right? This is not mom putting the child to bed. This is dad at home putting the child to bed. And dad is not this idealized, propagandized Aryan man, but he's this very average, normal guy, softer and less authoritarian than the image that was being promoted by the Nazis of what the German family might look like. And you can see here, any of you are parents in the room, bedtime's not going well, right? And instead of coming down with this rather like iron fist, there's a comment in this like instead of like croup steel, right? He's not that man. He's going to play with his son, he's going to talk to his son, and then at the end of the day, he's actually going to crawl in bed and just put him to bed that way, right? The kind of thing that really speaks to a family and how things really work in a home, but very much the antithesis of the story that's being told about the German family and the traditional family values that are being extolled by the Nazi hierarchy. This becomes a wildly popular comic series to the point that the Nazis end up co-opting the characters and using it to promote their own fundraising around charity drives. So here you can see quite literally, I'm going to move my mouse. I hope you can see it. This bald head right here is the father. There's the son, and he's got the little charity bucket. And they are there during this winter relief campaign to raise money from the community. So you can see that even though he has tried to kind of recreate himself and he's actually being critical of the Nazi system, he is also complicit in it in that he is forced to and then agrees to participate in their marketing and their propaganda. In 1940, he actually moves over to Das Reich, which is a Nazi Party publication. His approach to resistance there, again, this is a man trying to put food on the table. He's not willing to make a huge stink over everything, but he is not willing to promote direct party propaganda. Instead, he frames his messages, his political cartooning, in terms of German nationalism. In a time of war, he is taking shots at the Allies. He's making commentary on Americans, giving weapons to the Allies and dropping bombs on Germany. You can see here on the right, this bear is a representation of the Soviet Union. So he is working for the Nazis. He is delivering their wartime message, but not some of their party priority messages. I encourage you to look him up. He also becomes involved in the Nazi version of Disney and is involved in the production of a small cartoon, deeply racist. So he does cross that bridge a little bit later. So this is a man who has moved over, almost the full 12 years from being banned and ostracized to finding his kind of safe pocket. How can he operate? How can he still message, but keep himself safe? This comes to an end in March of 1944. And I urge you as we move forward now to think about the dates and how many of these things are happening in 1944. He's denounced by the people who he shares a home with. Osler is hard of hearing and he speaks too loudly. And even though he's working for the Nazis, he is critical of them at home. And something he says is reported by his housemates. He is arrested. He is also tried in the people courts. And you can see that April 1944, he ends up committing suicide in his cell because he's going to be convicted. So kind of a wide variety of individual responses. And you can see how deeply personal and how complicated they can become as you move through time. I spend a little bit now to look at groups and how they resisted. And we're going to start with opposition from workers. The Nazis were always aware of the threat to them from organized labor. Organized labor, usually in the form of unions, tends to be left-leaning. In this time and in this space, it was often communist or socialist. So not just left-leaning, but deeply politically divided from who the Nazis were. And there was a great effort to break unions, but they still needed this labor. And so these men they couldn't unionize, they couldn't formally gather as these political groups, but they were still there and they still had their thoughts, right? So what we see are collections of just ordinary German workers often still facilitated by these leftover leaders. They were still communists, even though they couldn't admit that they were communists. And we would see these kinds of, again, often distribution of information. They are putting out literature of various kind, leaflets, posters, graffiti, messaging to the broad public. They are, think of it like water cooler talk. They're having these kind of small group meetings at work where they're being critical of Nazi policy. Sometimes these are organized gatherings, other times they aren't. This couriering of information, though communism as a party had been outlawed, the network still existed. And so the ability to pass information from city to city, from factory to factory, still existed. And they were also instrumental in aiding people who had been murdered, the families of people who had been murdered, the families of people who had kind of disappeared to concentration camps and labor camps. This was a fascinating example that I thought was worth sharing with you. After 1939, the focus really becomes on the war and trying to deliver more accurate, more real information about the status of the war than what's being reported by the Nazis. So this, it's almost like a graphic novel, right? It reads a little bit like a comic strip. You've got these small pockets of images and text. This came out in June 1942 in the Ruhr region. And now what we all know is that this is during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and with it, the mass execution of Jews in that space. And so in June of 1942, so this is immediate. This is lightning speed for 1942. We have this circulating in the Ruhr region where they are sometimes accurately and sometimes inaccurately describing these war crimes being committed in the name of the German government. So you can see what's wrong here, right? They know that they are civilians. That's right. Women, children being dragged to execution. They don't have the clarity to know the difference that these are not just Russian civilians writ large, but that predominantly these are Jewish people. They understand that the SS are involved. They don't have the clarity of all of the agencies that are involved, but they know that the SS are instrumental in this murder campaign. So it's a real significant example of the kind of information that's being disseminated. Obviously, this is not what the Nazis want coming back into the interior of Germany, reporting the execution of civilians. But already in June 1942, this is the kind of correspondence that we're seeing circulated in some of these worker networks. When we think of organized groups, one of the things that we immediately think of is the youth. I want to give you two great examples of resistance among very young people in the Nazi regime. The first are the swing kids. You can see here centered in Hamburg, Berlin, Frankfurt. So these kind of major metropolitan centers. This is a very urban group of kids. Hamburg becomes particularly important. It's a port city. It's got a lot of international kind of connections, right? As a port city, this is a place where those English and American records are going to show up first in Germany before they're distributed through the country. And these kids just have access to this. This is also kind of the height of this jazz movement. And these young people are excited about this new music that's more fun than what mom and dad are listening to. You can see here, these are high school kids. These are predominantly 14 to 18-year-olds, fairly affluent, fairly well educated. And what they are resisting is the conformity. They are not deeply worried about Nazi policy around race or Nazi policy around the war, except that they may have to serve in it. What they don't want is to be told by the state who they have to be and what culture they're allowed to consume and what message that culture is allowed to give to them. Um, the boys, not just the boys, these kids for the Nazis didn't dress right. They didn't do their hair right. They didn't wear their makeup right. They were considered to be promiscuous. Jazz was considered Jewish and Black, and very anti-German or not German enough. So you can see that this lack of conformity, this lack of willingness to join the Hitler Youth and go to war training drills is something that's deeply antithetical to what the Nazis want. It doesn't actually take long for this to be noticed by the Nazis. And I'm not talking about the local Nazis, I'm talking about nationally. So you can see here some of the things that are of particular concern to the Nazi hierarchy. These are kids who are having confrontations with the German police. They are having confrontations with the Hitler Youth. They are opposed to military service and the war. And in particular, maybe one of the most damning things for them is that they do not want to kind of highlight what is considered German culture, that they're Anglophiles. They are kind of famous for being a little too flip. We call it here being bold in their gatherings. Um, they gather in very large numbers. They are playing loud music. They are dressed in a way that makes them obvious targets. And so they get a little bit loose and they become fairly easy targets. The Hitler Youth is involved in kind of identifying who is in the Swing Kids, where they are meeting and what they're doing. And already in March of 1940, we're seeing the Gestapo involved against children, right? This is not going after communists. This is the Gestapo going after 14-year-olds. So you can see this particular raid that we've highlighted, 408 people were listed. They raid this dance and they take everybody's name. And then based on that list, they then go back and arrest 63 of these kids. And then there are waves of arrests and raids after that. By and large, it didn't stop the kids from having their party. They didn't want to conform. But you can see here that ultimately almost 400 people, 400 kids end up arrested in these raids. They're interrogated, they're sent to detention centers, and still it doesn't stop. And so what we see in late 1941, early 1942 is this is actually elevated to the level of the SS. Heinrich Himmler, who is head of the SS, tells Heydrich that he wants a crackdown on these kids. Now, I want to stop for just a minute and put in your mind where we are in January of 1942 and what's on Reinhard Heydrich's plate. January of 1942, he's about to hold the Wannsee Conference. He's about to tell the major German officials what their role is in the destruction of the Jewish people of Europe. They're about to commit genocide across all of continental Europe. He's got that mechanism in place and that project in front of him. He is also the governor of Bohemia and Moravia. So he's governing that Czech land and presiding over that government in Prague. And that tells you how significant they thought this counterculture movement was. That this man who had these things on his to-do list was now going to crack down on 14 to 18-year-olds in Hamburg. And you can see the language they're using here about radical extermination of this ideology and a need to re-educate these kids in concentration camps. Kind of a rural counterpart to the swing kids, if they were the kind of urban counterculture youth movement, the Edelweiss Pirates, who hands down have the best resistance name in all of history, are kind of the rural counterpart to that. You can see here it's predominantly a Western European phenomenon, pretty much the same class age of kids, high school, 14 to 18 or 17. This is a more working class movement, whereas the others were maybe slightly higher educated and more affluent families. And in some ways, they don't seem as counterculture, right? If you look at these kids, they are dressed in a way that is less provocative. They don't have the long hair and the makeup, and they're out in some pastoral setting with their guitars, having kind of a nice German picnic. where they shared values about being in the open and hiking and this kind of pastoral German idealism, they had deep ideological divides and in many ways were more proactively resisting policy than the swing kids ever were. So also nonconformist, but working in a very specific way as a group to counter Nazi goals. So you can see here some of what they were doing: anti-Nazi graffiti, you know, the kind of things you might expect from a kid, defying curfews. But they are also doing things like ambushing and assaulting Hitler Youth patrols, literally like knocking these guys off their bikes, roughing them up, and breaking the wheel on the bike, right? So they're coming into some physical and direct altercations with their peers who are more ideologically driven and more kind of aligned to the Nazi worldview. And then these three that I've highlighted on the bottom, I think are particularly relevant because, again, these are high school kids, 14 to 18. They are assisting people who are being persecuted by the Nazis. They are conducting small acts of sabotage against the Nazi system. Again, they're not stopping the war, but what can I do to slow something down? What can I do to make it more difficult to normalize these things that I don't agree with? And they are at some point literally dealing with explosive things, which is not what most people want 14-year-olds doing. But in many ways, the youth often leads a resistance. Again, a government response. Before 1944, you do see some roundups, but predominantly they're released, right? They will shave their heads as a mark of shame. They may send them for some re-education in some sort of a kind of a penal situation, but these are usually temporary holds. In the fall of 1944, again, there is a crackdown ordered. And again, the difference between we're having a party that's counterculture and we're dealing with explosives, right? But this crackdown results in the arrest of several of these Edelweiss pirates and some other considered aberrant youth group people. And you can see here in November of 1944 in Cologne, there's actually a public execution. You can look this up on YouTube. There is some documentary uh, film that you can look at surrounding this particular execution. Um, but they are executing children in November 1944 in a public space in Cologne. And again, I want you to think about the time. Where are we in 1944? By November of 1944, the active murder phase of the Holocaust is done. The death camps have largely been disassembled. Um, the Nazis are decommissioning the gas chambers at Auschwitz because they're not going to actively murder the Jews in that way anymore. Himmler is starting to think about what might be possible in terms of a separate peace with the Western Allies. And in this moment where the Soviet army is very deep into Polish territory, moving towards Eastern Germany, and the Americans are about a month away from the Battle of the Bulge. So we've come as far as Belgium. And there's this compression happening on the German government, and things are falling inward, where they are losing control of the international space. They are going to exert control at home. They are going to make sure that there isn't dissent in their space. And so that is when we see these kinds of mass reprisals. Briefly, the Rosenstrasse protest. This is a 1943 protest by non-Jewish German women. So these are non-Jewish women married to Jewish men, and in a much larger roundup. This is right after the Battle of Stalingrad has failed. And there is this movement in Berlin to round up the Jewish community and deport them. And amidst this sweep, some of these people with protected status, people who were married to non-Jewish spouses, are also picked up. And they are taken to the Jewish Community Center on the Rosenstrasse, and they're being held there for multiple days. And it is the perception of their wives and their mothers that they're going to be deported. And while they don't really know what that means, they know it's not good. They know people don't come back and that it's a very severe thing. So these women, small groups at first and later larger groups, stand outside this facility where their husbands are being held. And while the Gestapo are kind of sifting through paperwork, they stand out there and basically hold a vigil. And it's this remarkable moment late in the war where there is this direct public statement about the deportation of Jewish people from Germany, and it is picked up somewhat in the international news. What we know now is that these men were not actually destined for deportation. The Gestapo's goal in picking them up was to send them to forced labor. Their papers were sorted, they were released, and just days later, they were then repicked up and sent to forced labor. So it's an interesting moment, too, for us to consider what is the outcome of protest or what is the outcome of resistance? Does it have to be successful to matter? In this case, these men were re um, they were picked up again and sent to labor. So in that way, it didn't protect them from that. But it's an interesting moment again to consider these women still made a stand. They didn't know what we know now. They thought they were protesting this deportation. They thought they were making a stand that would in some way influence anti-Jewish policy. And the we can't know when we protest something, will it be successful or not? And we have to be wary of only protesting when we know the outcome. That sometimes, again, slow it down, buy people time, give space and distance. Um, the last example in this set, this is again kind of this balance of individual and collective response. So many of you will have heard of the White Rose. I want to tell you a little bit about the family that was kind of at the heart of this, the Scholl family. We think about Hans and Sophie, and we'll get to them in a minute, but they came from an anti-fascist family. Their father, Robert, was a local mayor, and he had been deeply critical of the Nazis through the 1920s. He had had run-ins with them over the years, and then once they come to power, he's imprisoned more than once for speaking out against Nazi policy. It's actually a source of trauma for Robert that his kids are kind of taken by the Nazi youth groups. They're kids, they're kind of swept up in the moment. The boys are in the Hitler Youth, the girls are in the German Girls organization. And it's not until later that they begin to reject those ideals and form their own path. This kind of starts with one of the younger sons, Werner. He is the first of the Scholl siblings to kind of reject Nazism. You can see here that he resigns his membership in the Hitler Youth, which was a mandatory organization for German children. Because of that, he is denied entrance into the university. He's not allowed to sit the exam and go to university. And you can see here a couple of his protests, blindfold the Lady of Justice with the swastika flag. He ends up being sent to the Eastern Front as a soldier and not returning. And what we know is that this is one of the things that weighs heavily on the siblings, that their brother was sent to fight for this cause that he didn't believe in and lost his life in that process. Hans, who is maybe one of the siblings that you have heard of, was deeply committed to his Nazi youth. And you can see here in 1935, he is a standard bearer from his community to the big Nuremberg rally in September 1935, where they end up passing the Nuremberg laws. So this is a kid who is kind of being given a leadership position and honor within his Hitler Youth group. And gradually, as he matures, as he comes into more contact with Nazism, he moves away from that conformity and starts to build his own thoughts and ideals. You can see here that he also leaves the Hitler Youth, and that in 1937 he is arrested because of that affiliation with a different group. And he is also an individual who is charged under paragraph 175, which is the persecution of largely gay men, not only men, but gay men in Nazi Germany. He is not convicted under 175 and he's not sent to a concentration camp. You can see here that the judge dismissed it as a youthful failing. Sophie, the most famous of these siblings, is first arrested at the age of 16 because of Hans's failure to be a member of the Hitler Youth. So you can imagine a teen's sense of injustice that she has been imprisoned by the state for something that she didn't do, right? And what we know about Sophie in particular is that each of her interactions with the Nazis further removes her from their orbit. Every time she comes in contact with their kind of oppressive, this is what you must believe approach, she pulls further back from it. We know that happened. She was sent into service twice. You can see here in 1941, she spends 6 months uh, being kind of conscripted as a nursery school teacher. And then in 1942, she's sent again. She works in a metalworks plant, kind of like think of it like a rivet plant. And at each of those turns, she becomes more disenfranchised from the Nazi system. In 1942, so again, think about what this means. This is the height of the persecution of the Jews of Poland. They begin attending the University of Munich, and they come into contact with a professor of philosophy that um, agrees with them and supports their views and nurtures their kind of defiance of this system. We know that they were inspired by Bishop von Galen and his anti-euthanasia sermons. We also know that they were deeply moved by the reports coming back from the Eastern Front, uh, both of the atrocities that were being committed and of kind of the loss of young life, right? Their own brother is there. And uh, this is not what they wanted him to die for. So this group is the foundation of what becomes the White Rose. It is a German student group based out of the University of Munich. And they operate in a few ways. One is aimed at the community, like the broader Munich community. You can see here that they are out graffitiing. They're also disseminating some literature that is saying things as simple as down with Hitler, right? So they're going on the outside of the buildings at the university. They're going to the Marienplatz in Munich, and they're kind of at night putting these messages out. Nobody knows who they are at this point, but they're out disseminating this information. And then what they're most famous for is this leaflet campaign. Again, distributed by them at the University of Munich and then redistributed throughout Germany. You can see it's actually a really broad distribution all the way up in Hamburg, all the way down into Austrian cities. These leaflets are largely aimed at students. And it is calling into question broad swaths of Nazi policy, but it is inclusive of the murder of Jews. Because again, this is the moment. Basically, at the same time, June 1942, when these kids are forming, when that workers' pamphlet is coming out about the shootings in the former Soviet Union, this is also the moment that the death camps in Poland are really going online. July 1942, July 22nd, 1942 is when the Warsaw Ghetto is being evacuated to Treblinka. So it's interesting to think about how much information was really getting back and who felt it was important to spread this broadly. And in this case, it was these students. In February 1943, they got a little bit too visible as they were throwing pamphlets. They were identified by a handyman. Sometimes he's called a handyman, sometimes a janitor, but a worker at the University of Munich. He stopped them. They were turned over to university officials first, who then turned them over to the Gestapo. They were arrested, they were interrogated, they were tried in the People's Court. Several were released after some amount of time served, but several were executed by guillotine. And you can see here, including Sophie and Hans Scholl and their professor, Kurt Huber. And finally, and very briefly, um, there are, at least as far as we know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 either assassination attempts or plans that were organized against Hitler. So I want to look at just two of those, just to give you a sense of the range. This first one, the Berger Braukeller bomb attempt, was orchestrated by a man named Georg Elser. He is a lone wolf. He's not operating as part of a system. He's not part of a network. He is just somebody who, um, though it's not so much that he was worried about Nazism. You can see the quote from him on the bottom. I did not want to eliminate Nazism. He really just felt that the leadership was wrong. And so his interest was in how to decapitate the leadership of this political organization, and then the state would go on and be a better place. So he falls on the idea that one of the best ways to get a set of Nazi leaders together is to target one of the speeches that Hitler is going to give, because there would be other high-level Nazis in the room. So he picks the Berger Braukeller, which is a Munich beer hall, and you can see the date, November 8th. The Nazis are always going to be in Munich on November 8th, commemorating the beer hall putsch and the loss of those men. So he knows that there's going to be a speech that day. He spends a great deal of time doing reconnaissance. He actually ends up moving to Munich, and then he spends the nights. He like kind of locks himself in and spends the night in the Berger Braukeller, kind of excavating a space in a pillar in a column where he's going to hide a time detonated bomb. So he knows the day. He knows when Hitler is supposed to be there. He knows approximately how long Hitler is going to speak. And he sets the bomb and he walks out. What he could not account for is the fact that the weather that day called for fog, and that Hitler wanted to fly back to Berlin, but instead he was going to have to take the train. And because of that, he speaks for less time so that he can make the train schedule. The bomb detonates, it kills some people. You can see here the bottom picture, some destruction of the building. It was a really significant explosion. Georg has kind of fled toward the Swiss border. And given the way he was captured, the belief is that he was probably looking for a little bit of a hero's reception. He kind of wanted to be found with certain material on him. He had a postcard of the Berger Braukeller with some incriminating writing on it that suggested that he was part of this attempt. He had some fuses on him, some things that were incriminating. So instead of having successfully executed Hitler, he has now been captured and he is taken as a special prisoner. I'm air quoting if you can't see me. And again, you're going to see this date come up, April 9th, 1945. He's held until the very end of the war and executed at Dachau. The interesting thing about him, too, is that his failed attempt thwarted a better organized attempt by a group of military men who then called off their attempt because of the heightened awareness and the heightened security then around Hitler. Kind of the flip side of this, and if you know one assassination story, this is the one you know, the July 20th plot to kill Hitler. Again, very late in the war. At this point, the Hungarian Jews have even been murdered. So the Holocaust is, in terms of an active murder campaign, it's over. The war is lost. Like by July 1944, the Soviets are halfway into Polish territory, and Americans are on the ground in France. So this is a time when the military leaders around Hitler have become very concerned about the choices that he has made in the execution of the war. And this is a plot of military men supported by civilians working with the military intelligence to attempt to assassinate Hitler. He has a um, kind of bunker facility deep in Ukraine. It is called the Wolf's Lair. There's going to be a meeting there, and these men plant a bomb there. A couple of things go wrong. They're meant to be two bombs, but only one of them, they only have time to kind of activate one of them. And the other problem is that the suitcase that it's sitting in gets moved. Instead of being kind of out on the edge under the table where Hitler was going to be sitting, it gets pushed deeper. And when it explodes, Hitler is injured, but he is not killed, though other men are. Again, you can see the kind of degree of destruction of the space. It was a successful bomb. It just didn't kill the man that they intended for it to kill. This was part of a broader plot. The intent was to kill Hitler and to bring into custody many of the other Nazi high command. So Goebbels, Himmler, and Goering were all supposed to be kind of picked up by other operatives in this network and brought into custody so that a new government could be installed and negotiate a peace with the Allies. In the aftermath of this, they arrest approximately 7,000 people. 7,000 people were not involved in this attempt on Hitler's life. This is a moment of retribution. Of those 7,000 people, you can see that nearly 5,000 were executed. So this is a matter of settling scores and kind of taking out any opposition that might stand against the Nazi government that still exists within the military. This really is the end of organized resistance in Nazi Germany. The rest of the war will now play out, and it takes the Allies reaching Berlin to stop the rest of this. This is the moment where Dietrich Bonhoeffer comes back into our story. He was, again, connected to the Abwehr, that German military intelligence, and he was linked to being a courier in the system. So he is arrested with those 7,000 men. You can see that, again, taken to the People's Court. He was taken to Flossenburg and hanged on April 9th. And that will be a date that is particularly resonant in terms of Nazi retribution towards active resistors. This is a moment at the very end of the war, days before these camps would have been liberated. It's the last moment where they can execute these people who had stood against their system. So this is where I leave you with this parting thought. This is a quote by Raoul Hilberg, a Holocaust historian, and he says that at crucial junctures, every individual makes decisions. And again, I put to you that choosing not to act is still a choice, right? That we are all, wherever we are, confronted with choices, and that those end up being individual, right? We have to personally make the commitments that we want to make and the stands that we want to make, and that what this history does is give us kind of a mirror to reflect in, right? It's an opportunity to consider what was possible, what kinds of moral or ethical choices we saw as viable. But if we leave it in history, we're doing a disservice to the memory of the people who were lost in the Holocaust and in this war. These are the lessons that we need to grapple with as people in the world today. I am going to stop there and invite questions.
What?
There's no online questions at this moment.
All right, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you.
So we don't currently have any online questions, but if you do have questions online, make sure to send those directly to Professor Marquis or, well, she's gonna see it before anyone else does. So send it directly to Professor Marquis. Does anyone in the audience here today have specific questions for Jessica?
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. My uncle was in the army for the US government. And he was driving a truck into Germany out of Italy. They started out in North Africa and came up into Europe. But anyway, when they got to Germany, he said there was this stench in the air and they didn't have any idea what it was. And then they got word from Eisenhower, who told them to take lots of pictures. He says, the world is not going to believe this. And then when they got to Dachau and they found all the bodies that were mounted. My uncle, being a farm boy, knew how to run a tractor. And he dug trenches to bury these people. I mean, it was just horrifying. And he lived to 95, and he did not tell his family about this until almost a year or so before he passed away. And I asked my cousin one time, I said, did you ever notice anything? And she said, well, she said he checked himself into the hospital once in a while, and the doctor, our local physician that our family went to, was a doctor during World War II. So I think, we're talking about PTSD, and the doctor understood what was going on. And anyway, and I know my dad would go over there and do chores for him. But it's a horrible thing that went on.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
I have a question from online. Did Hitler target the 94 Social Democrats who voted against the dissolution of the legislature?
Yes. If you go to Berlin now, outside the Reichstag, there's actually a memorial. It's not just the Social Democrats, but there's a memorial to the legislators who were executed in the Nazi period from other political parties. Large number of Social Democrats. So they were rounded up and they were sent to those early concentration camps.
I have one. Riley has a question.
Hi, I'm just wondering, what was the most common kind of resistance that you saw in this specific area? Since it's mostly German citizens resisting the government, more of a political resistance, so I wanna know kind of what you saw there in your research.
Yeah, not Jews in the Holocaust, but within Germany, German citizens, I would say the most common kind of resistance is in some way tied to the dissemination of information. It is individuals doing leaflets or postcards or couriers working in a network. Information is power, right? And one of the things that authoritarians try to do is control the narrative and try to control the way that people consume information. And so and again, it wasn't always perfect information. Not everything's accurate, but seeking out that kind of information and trying to disseminate it to other people, I think is probably the most common kind of resistance that we could point to.
All right, I am going to take co-organizer's prerogative and ask a question of my own. And I know you may not be able to answer it, but what can we take from this in our current situation in order to affect change as we watch history begin to run?
That's a big one. I have a layered answer that may not be totally satisfying, but I think one thing is that inaction is a choice, but it's not an acceptable choice. That one way or another, it is incumbent on us as students of this history to recognize patterns and to react to them. And that the way we do that will be individual and based on our privilege and our agency. What I can do may be different than what you can do, will be different than what someone else in the room can do. but that we have to take some ownership of we've learned this history, we know where these patterns take us, and that resistance early is more effective than resistance later. So I think my urging is to be a good student of history and choose an action. We are deeply moved. You can tell I brought it up multiple times. If Shelley was here, she would be emphasizing it as well. This idea of you can't fix everything, but you must do something, right? This concept of slow it down, um, make it more difficult to normalize the abnormal. That's what I hope that people take away from this lesson.
Oh, we got one more question.
Why is this not being taught in school? Why do kids not even know about this?
Well, I mean, that's not a simple answer either. It is taught in school. My son is doing a 4-week unit on the Holocaust in 8th grade right now. Um, so it's a balance, right? There are teachers who are teaching it, there are teachers who aren't. So it depends on where you are. I can tell you that in Hays, Kansas, I think you have pretty robust Holocaust education in both your middle and high school and in obviously coming out of the university and going into the community. One of the things that I would point to, usually when you hear people don't know anything about the Holocaust, they're referring to a claims conference study that says that millennials don't know what Auschwitz was, they don't know how many people were killed in the Holocaust. Millennials are in their 40s. And it is true that millennials did not have fantastic Holocaust education. Centers like mine are 33 years old. So there certainly is a gap, and there is always more work to do. Kansas is a non-mandate state, so we do rely on the goodwill of educators to choose to have this in their curriculum, or local school districts to choose to have this in their curriculum. So I guess that, one thing that you could be thinking about as a community is how can you support your schools in making sure that Holocaust education is happening for them? Make sure that it's in your curriculum in Hayes or Plainville or Russell or wherever, whatever community you're there from, and encourage those teachers to connect to the professors at Fort Hayes and my center, and to get good resource support, because this is a really hard thing to teach and teachers don't have a lot of time to do it. And so the more support they have, the better.
What do you say to Holocaust deniers?
That's a great question. So when I began this career 23 years ago, Holocaust denial was such a fringe phenomenon that we really didn't encounter it. And my answer has been and always will be that Nazis on trial for their life didn't say it didn't happen. They said, I didn't do it. They said I was following orders. They would pass the buck, but they never said it didn't happen. And they themselves are the ones who documented it. So that's my short answer. My longer answer is that we've moved from Holocaust denial is so radical that you don't encounter it. It only exists in these dark spaces, which was my experience 23 years ago. Then we moved through this period of more sophisticated, what we call revisionism. They didn't say it didn't happen, but they said it didn't happen that way. The numbers aren't right. It couldn't have been this, right? So they started to pick away and kind of mitigate the story. We are now back to true denial. And we have true deniers that have access to platforms on major cable news networks. They have access to having dinner with major current political leaders. They have a kind of unfiltered platform on social media. They can literally say anything they want and be getting away with it. And so real denial is back in a way that we could not have even imagined 5 years ago. It is no longer on the fringe. It has very much been invited into the center, and it's being discussed as though it's a valid thing to discuss. Our job is to reject it entirely. We do not debate it. It is a simple answer. Holocaust happened because here is the evidence, the German evidence, the survivor evidence, the fact that the Germans themselves did not deny it.
All right, it looks like we don't have any other questions, but thank you again for filling in for Dr. Klein this evening. Please tell Shelley that we missed her tremendously and I look forward to touching base with her soon. For those of you in the audience, don't forget that we have 3 other events scheduled this month. Our final speaker, Dr. Chad Gibbs, will be here in Hayes, Kansas, and he is absolutely amazing. He's actually from Wyoming as well, so he's kind of from this region and understands this space. So be sure to come to all of those events if you can, or at least 1 or 2. And then Dr. Rockhold is always available to reach out to via email if you have questions about this material, or for those of you who are educators, or I know we have some future educators in the room, to talk to you about lesson planning and how to integrate this material into your classrooms. So once again, thank you so much, Jessica, for coming out today. And do have a beautiful evening.
I